Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox and Matt Kelly back again for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Today, we're going to take up a topic near and dear to our collective hearts, which is, do you need to be a lawyer to be a CCO? So, Matt, what do you think about that?
Tom, it's a fascinating and age old question. And the reason we are talking about it now is that a recruitment firm for compliance professionals, Barker Gilmore, they recently put out a compensation survey that I'm sure a lot of listeners have probably seen streak across your LinkedIn feed, where they talked generally about all sorts of compensation metrics for compliance people. But the thing that jumped out to me was their finding that compliance officers with law degrees make more money, and in many instances, a lot more money than compliance officers without law degrees. And we are specifically talking about the Juris Doctorate you get by going to law school. And so I just kind of riffed on why is that? And we can specifically look to several reasons why lawyers might make more money, but clearly, corporate America thinks there is some sort of premium to be paid to compliance officers with a law degree because they're paying the premium. And to be clear, this premium can, in some ways, be a lot of money. For example, a CCO with a law degree at a publicly traded company makes $295,000 more in total compensation than their public company CCO counterpart without a law degree. Now, I get it that the 295 grand, that's probably driven a lot by equity awards that public companies can give, which are typically worth a lot of money. But even if you look at the private or nonprofit worlds, CCOs in those sectors who have JDs make considerably more money, tens of thousands of dollars per year more than CCOs without a JD. So I just kind of riffed on why really would a compliance officer need a law degree? And my conclusion that honestly, I don't think you do. And there are some misconceptions out there among the hiring world, perhaps, about the importance of a compliance officer having a law degree. And we see that a lot. If you looked at the job openings that are advertised on LinkedIn and elsewhere for chief compliance officers, plenty of them will say in the requirements, must have a law degree. And really, when you think about what a compliance department does, like, why? Why do you absolutely need a law degree to do these things? And we can talk about why I think you don't. It's just quite interesting to see that clearly corporate America thinks you do because they're paying more money for those people who do have law degrees. There's a disconnect there.
So, I'd like to break those down into two separate questions, Matt. First, I'd like to take on the pay uplift from having a JD. And I would posit there are three reasons for that. One is historical, that compliance evolved out of legal. And so lawyers in a general counsel's office were moved to legal, or someone like myself was hired in as a chief compliance officer who'd been in a corporate legal department. So corporations didn't see a differentiation in a pay scale. And so for that reason, where compliance started particularly in the first decade of this year, were a lot of lawyers moving over to compliance. So they took that pay grade with them. Number two is that they is still perceived in the corporate world something of value to having a law degree, whether that's you went to school for 3 more years, whether you learned to think like a lawyer, whether you have some additional skills, correct or not, that is viewed as value. And so it's going to be compensated more highly. And the third is that it really is derivative of the first two, that lawyers just get paid more generally. Now, I think the first one, or I guess the second and third, may not be valid anymore, but we're still stuck with that sort of historical reason. And if corporations move away from hiring lawyers as compliance professionals, maybe that scale will change. But I think that's the reason, or at least the three I would posit. Any thoughts one way or the other on that?
I think your points are well taken. In fact, it is worth noting that several weeks ago, this same recruitment firm, Barker Gilmore, they published a separate second compliance and compensation survey for compliance and legal professionals. You could compare the two, and it is clear that legal professionals do make far more money. They make more money in every single way, more annual salary, more performance bonus, more equity compensation. So I do see your point that when companies think that the compliance officer comes out of legal, they're starting from a very high base because lawyers are generally paid more, especially general counsels who routinely in total compensation were making millions of dollars, although that I think is also largely because they get big equity awards. Compliance professionals get medium or small equity awards, but equity is still quite valuable. But I also do think that it is historically true that, yes, lawyers make a lot of money because they've needed to make a lot of money. You go to law school and you often take on a lot of debt, and you come out and you're working at a law firm that is paying you gobs of money, except I don't know that you're rolling in it because you also have a monthly legal law school education debt that's probably thousands of dollars. So goes right out the door. But all that just simply means that the firms are paying high salaries and nobody's going to leave unless a corporation is able to match those salaries. And there's effects like that. Tom, the one thing that stuck with me though is where you say that corporations believe that people with law degrees have some special skills. Yes and no. I mean, it is true that if you have a law degree, you could work in either compliance or in the legal department because you are a lawyer. So therefore, you have more versatility and utility. I guess that would translate into more compensation. But I don't necessarily see that a lot of what companies get hung up on there is valid anymore. I boiled it down to two things that really would make a compliance officer with a JD special. Number one, because they think like a lawyer. And we all know that means that really you've gone through the first year of law school where it's much more about critical thinking, good legal writing, good analysis, of familiarity with criminal procedure. But if that's all that really is needed for thinking like a lawyer, in theory, you could stop there. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but second and third year is more about teaching you what the law actually is and then applying your first year law skills to think like a lawyer about this law in contracts or that law in cybersecurity or privacy. But, thinking like a lawyer, you've largely learned that by the end of the first year of law school. Alternatively, if you just want somebody who knows what the compliance law is, I think a lot of compliance professionals could either learn that on the job or they could go to one of these continuing education masters in compliance law programs that are sprouting like weeds at every higher institution in this higher education institution in the country these days. They're offering something like that for the continuing professional who does not want to go to law school, but does want to get basically a graduate degree in thinking like a lawyer in compliance law. But the only other thing that I thought of that came to my mind is maybe corporations like people with law degrees because you can do what I said is those magical things that only lawyers can do. But the only magical thing a corporate lawyer can do is invoke attorney client privilege, which really isn't that magical. If you need somebody to invoke the privilege, you, the non JD compliance officer, could just call up legal, who is probably 2 doors down the hall from you, and say, "I have this thing that's kinda weird. Could you please look it over?" And now the privilege is invoked. Like, it's not brain surgery to invoke attorney-client privilege for a matter. You just need a corporate lawyer floating around and you grab them. And compliance officers can do that. So I think a lot of the historical reasons of why having a JD, oh, they need to have a law degree to be able to do the job. No, I don't think that is true any longer. I'm not sure it was ever true, but I do not think it is true anymore for the modern demands of what a compliance function must be able to do.
That leads us to point number two, which is what are those modern demands? And frankly, Matt, I thought this was the more interesting part of your blog post, which of course we'll link to, because you laid out what a compliance officer needs to do and some of the skills that you saw necessary to do that. So I would explore that. And I really wanted to start with your paragraph entitled What Compliance Needs and what effective functions that a compliance officer needs to be able to work through.
Yeah. So I came up with 5 principal things that a compliance function needs to do. They are, in no particular order, investigations, policy management, education and training of the workforce, due diligence, and risk assessment. And really, that's it, I think. If there's anything else I have forgotten, maybe reporting to the board. And if I've forgotten any other bullet points, somebody wants to write in and let us know, please do. But really, if you can do those things, if your compliance function can do those things, your compliance function is in okay shape. It's hitting all of the bases. Out of all of them, however, I think that really the only one that kinda, sorta comes close to you should be a lawyer to do it might be investigations because, again, it might be a sensitive matter where you want to invoke attorney-client privilege. However, just because you are a lawyer and can invoke the privilege, that does not mean you are good at investigations. And I have met more than my fair share of lawyers who are terrible at investigations. I'm sure many listeners have also done that. And I know some plenty great investigators who are not lawyers. And if it is so easy to be able to bring in a lawyer from the corporate legal team down the hall, if privilege really is that important, I don't think you need to be a lawyer for that, and you certainly do not need to be a lawyer for policy management, education and training, due diligence, risk assessment. I can make an argument that a great marketing person would be much better at education and training. A great data analyst or a great internal auditor would be better at risk assessment and potentially even due diligence than a lawyer. A lot of why companies get hung up on, oh, you need to be a lawyer for what compliance functions actually do. No, you don't. And Tom, that gets to I suppose, my big final theory is that where is compliance? What is it really about? Is it something that comes from the legal department? And historically, yes, it did. So I think that this lawyer obsession is a vestige of that. But I'm not sure that really it belongs in the legal department anymore. If anything, a compliance department probably would roll into a risk management function, assuming it should roll into anything at all. And I'm all for the CCO reporting direct to the board. But if they have to report to somebody else, I think it would make much more sense for them to report to a chief risk officer than the general counsel.
Matt, the only thing I would add to your list that you may have baked this in, I just didn't see it, is some sort of monitoring and continuous improvement function. But I would also say that those are largely can be done by tech solutions with appropriate compliance trained oversight. In
Yep.
terms of your last point, though, I think it's spot on because certainly when I moved into a compliance function, it was in an era when FCPA compliance programs and other compliance programs were either regulatory driven, if you were a regulated industry, or driven by the Department of Justice. And certainly in the energy industry, that meant the Department of Justice was driving compliance through enforcement of the FCPA. So compliance was seen as a response to legal or regulatory or legal enforcement. But that was nearly 20 years ago. And I think we have both seen the evolution of compliance to something much closer akin to a business process. At least I see it that way. And I advocate it should be a standalone function, but in some sort of overall risk management function, I can certainly see that as well. And the skills that I see a compliance officer need are similar to what you have just laid out. There could be a variety of skills, but it's going to be someone who can largely work with data and communicate. And unfortunately, lawyers are generally terrible about both unless they're communicating to a court in a written document. I think compliance has evolved and the skills needed for compliance professionals have evolved as well.
It's funny, Tom. A couple of years back, I spoke at a law school here in Boston where they invited me in to talk about compliance as a profession. And one of the students then asked me, so what are the important things to study to be a successful compliance officer? And I did say, I think the most important thing to know and understand is data management, although I'm assuming your law school doesn't teach that. And the law professor teaching the class who invited me kind of shot daggers at me and I think was giving me the finger underneath their desk. But it's true that really a successful compliance function today, it's much more about addressing risks for the company, period. If one of those risks is litigation and you have managed to avoid it, that's great. But if you wind up telling the board, the good news is we are fully compliant with the law, but the bad news is our poor due diligence has led to an IT disaster and we're not going to make our numbers this quarter, your situation is not improved. Everybody is still going to be on the firing line with the board. So there are a lot of skills now that don't necessarily get taught in the legal function. And Tom, it does bring up the last thing that I had wondered about with the article I wrote last week. If compliance doesn't necessarily need a law degree to be a successful compliance officer, and if compliance is more about risk management than legal work, what are the career paths for compliance officers who don't have a JD? Clearly, you're not going to be the general counsel or the deputy GC, which is routinely a path I do see with compliance officers who have a law degree. But if that is closed to you because you don't have a law degree, then what do you do after compliance? Now, maybe you want to be a chief compliance officer forever. I think it's awesome. I think you should. But in theory, maybe you could move into a chief risk officer role. Maybe you could move into an HR sort of a role, which sounds weird when you say it out loud, because I know that there's that frenemy relationship with HR, but nonetheless, I think there's a lot of overlap there. Conceivably, a chief compliance officer could become a chief HR person if that is what you want. And then, Tom, the other flip side of this is if you don't have a JD, but compliance is a career path you want, and ultimately it is about risk management, what are the sort of skills and experiences you would want to get earlier in your career? Now, most people I think who listen to this podcast are probably mid-career and they're either chief compliance officers or they're spitting distance to it. But what if you're 25, you're not going to go to law school? What sort of experience would you want in your career early stage to be able to seize that CCO sort of a role in risk management? And maybe you want to think more about being a data analyst. Maybe you want to think more about working in marketing. I know that large companies will often rotate promising employees among multiple business functions, let them see the whole thing. I think that's a wonderful idea. But compliance officers on the younger part of their career might want to pause and think, okay, if I don't want to go to law school, which is a lot of money, a lot of time, what else should I be doing now to be a good chief compliance officer in 10 years and then a good chief risk officer in 15 or 20 years? And that's an open question. And I left it there with my post. I don't know what the right answer is, but it opens up a lot of interesting considerations for people if you want to make a career out of compliance.
I'm going to start with a story. And that story is I taught a compliance and risk management class this summer at a law school. And there were about 25 students, half of which were JD candidates, half of which were MBA types. And there was one other student, and that student was an undergraduate in business process. And that student absolutely understood compliance as well as anyone I've ever taught. In the first or second session, uh, the student asked the question is, what's the role of pattern recognition in investigations? And I thought, wow, this person either listens to my Sherlock Holmes podcast or knows a heck of a lot. And this student, who I will remain nameless and gender neutral, aced the exam. And it was one of the best set of exam answers I'd seen. This student is, I guess, 21 or 22. And she has the concepts of compliance baked into their DNA as well as anyone I've seen. Um, and it really got me thinking about these topics that you raised in your blog post. And I think I should also add our demographics are little bit younger than you might think. 25 to 35 is our second highest demographic. So we're speaking to those people right now.
All
I
right.
think you're spot on to have a variety of skills to take, though, but to start in college. And this student is a business process, which I think that's what compliance is. And that this person is getting an engineering degree in business process. And this person can work with numbers. You were spot on to say the ability to work with numbers is a key skill, but it's also communication skills. It's understanding what the role of internal corporate communications is. It's understanding how to work with a framework like COSO to create a set of internal controls and then do move out from there to risk assessments, to due diligence, to many of the other things, the other 5 or 6, if you want to add mine, that you put in your blog post. So I think it's learning the non-legal stuff, the business process stuff, the thing that the business people have to learn. Because in a podcast this morning, I had a board of directors saying compliance is the front line in our company and it should be the front line. And those people need to understand how to employ compliance to protect our organization. We're going to ask the front line to protect. They should have some of the skills, and compliance people should be able to speak to them as frontline employees, either in sales or operationalization or operations in a company. So I think that those types of skills are available, but the thing is to get into the workplace and use those skills and see how other people do it and go to conferences and learn all the traditional matters that we've seen over the past 15 or 20 years.
It's a wonderful story about your student there, and it's funny, as I was listening to this, it sounds like, she or he would be very good as a probably an internal auditor of some type early in their career, because that also is more about business process analytics and testing and developing controls, and at that early stage, I do think.
But that seems like a great place for us to end this episode on. I think we're going to get to revisit this down the road.